Where?
Over to Indiana.
And-
Go over the open mountain.
Is it Midwest Orthopedic?
No, this is over in Warsaw, Indiana. I have no
Hey
idea.
Scott, can you just make sure I'm in frame for somebody? Maybe I should stand behind the desk.
No, you're the frame maker.
Yeah, you're close. The hair that way would be
Close enough.
center.
Okay.
You're good right
All right.
there.
So this presentation, the first, we're gonna have two. I'll be speaking about how Crete, the town, received its name. And then Tim Piepenbrink will be speaking about how his father, Ray Piepenbrink, got into Crete history. Is that correct? Okay. So I want to start out, there was an original story that most people know. So it originated, probably the first time it was printed up would have been the Crete's early history, March 1922, by the Crete Women's Club. So they're very historically minded, thank God for the Women's Club. And Minnie Hughes Baker wrote it, and she was the granddaughter of Willard Wood. And the first three paragraphs have nothing to do with my story, but it goes into my story really nice. Willard Wood was born in Randolph, Vermont, August 28, 1808. His grandfather was an Englishman who came to the Americas just after the Revolutionary War, and his father, Thomas Wood, a native of Massachusetts, was a soldier in the War of 1812, dying while in the service of his country. In 1834, Willard Wood was married to Diantha S. Boardman, sister of George Boardman of Joliet, who came to Illinois in 1836. With Mr. and Mrs. Wood and their daughter Sabrina, they left their home in Morristown, Vermont on May 5, 1836, making the trip by water via Detroit, where a horse, harness, and wagon were purchased for $90, arriving in Chicago, June 12, 1836. Proceeding south, Mr. Wood located on a claim of 80 acres southeast corner of Section 8, and also secured 80 acres in the southwest corner of Section 9, in what is now the village of Crete. Here he built a log cabin, which was known as Wood's Corners, and engaged in farming, and also working at the shoemaker's trade. He taught the first school in the winter of 1837-38 in a log schoolhouse, which had just been erected. So that would have been, well, the train tracks weren't here then, so it could have been where the train tracks were, but they say it's that garage, just on the east side of the train tracks, north side of Exchange, so a stone's throw from here. And of course, his log cabin was where the Clark gas station used to be, on the southeast corner of it, named in Exchange. And in 1840 was appointed school treasurer. He was elected Justice of the Peace soon after coming there, and that office he held for more than 40 years, so he was a lawyer by trade. And then this goes into how Crete was named, the original story. When Long John Wentworth was elected to Congress in 1843, he had a post office established, the first and only post office in the vicinity at that time, being at Thorn Grove, Monee Township. Mr. Wood was appointed postmaster by the congressman and was asked to give the office a name. Mr. Wood gave it the name of Crete, taking the name from an island mentioned in the history of St. Paul's journey as a prisoner to Rome, as related in the New Testament. And we're going to go to my own story. It is a letter discovered in 2014 from Mary Evelyn Cooper to my great-great-grandfather Ferris Gaines. Explains in further detail how Crete got its name and where the post offices of Crete existed before its current location. Mary Evelyn Cooper was a teacher at the District 1 school, also known as the Cooper/Schrage School, at the northeast corner of Exchange and Kings Road, currently where the Effmans Hall is in Crete. Her father was Samuel Ward Cooper, a pioneer who settled here in 1835, where the Speedway gas station is in University Park. Cooper's Corners was the intersection of Western and Exchange. Many years ago, so you had Wood's Corners. Whoever lived on that corner became their corner. Mary Cooper was born December 2nd, 1850, so about 13 years before Minnie Hughes Baker from the previous story, and died April 8th, 1915. The letter is presumed to have been written sometime between 1910 and 1915. The following paragraph is an excerpt from that letter. So I just want to say, I found this letter in my granddad Jackie's house on the corner of 2nd and Lincoln, the northwest corner. Ferris Gaines built that house in 1907, and he loved loved genealogy and he loved local history. So his office is virtually untouched. It's really cool. So I get to go through all of his papers. So I grabbed a bunch of stuff one night, took them home to my house, and that night we had a big thunderstorm and the power went out. And I was reading these letters by headline. So I kind of felt like I was in the old days, you know, reading by candlelight. And I came upon this letter and I could not believe what I was reading. So again, this was written by Mary Cooper to her cousin, Ferris Gaines. Father got his mail first at Chicago, then Joliet, and then Thornton. They sent a petition for a post office to be called Thorn Grove, but there was one by that name, and they had to select another. Old Mr. Bell on the Batchelder farm said he'd find one that they hadn't got, took his Bible and selected Crete. It was in Cook County at first, then at Dr. Horatio Hitchcock's. Your father was named after him. So he's talking about Ferris's father, Horatio Gaines. Horatio Hitchcock was a doctor, first doctor in Crete. Then at Dr. Horatio Hitchcock's, north of Crete, and then at Mr. Wood's. At the time of township organization, about 1850, the name Crete was given to the township. Yours truly, Mary Cooper. Obviously, this was a time before railroads and home mail delivery. If you wanted to get your mail, you had to go to the post office. It was all farmland. You know, the lots were extremely large, you know, minimum 10 acres, probably closer to 40 and 80. People had to travel to get their mail. It was also when the post office was in the postmaster's house or on their front porch. So whenever the postmaster changed, it would move. The old Mr. Bell she's referring to is most likely Crete's first postmaster, Henry D. Bell, born 1789. He was postmaster from February 12, 1838 through March 26, 1839. When Dr. Joseph Bradford Batchelder became Crete's second postmaster. Looking at old plat maps, general land office records, and the 1850 Rich Township census shows the Batchelder farmhouse / tavern at the northwest corner of Sauk Trail and Western Avenue. So if you're going north on Western past Stager and you get the Sauk Trail, you know, now it's all little, you know, Park Forest houses built up over that area. I read in a Chicago Heights history book that Bell owned the southeast corner of Sauk Trail and Western. It was in Cook County at first, in quotes. Probably refers to the Batchelder farm or the Henry Bell farm at the current intersection of Sauk Trail and Western. It's interesting that the Batchelder farm was a documented stop on the Underground Railroad and also later the location of the Indianwood Country Clubhouse. So they used, it was the first framed house in the area. All the others were log cabins. And it was such a nice house that when Victor Carlson developed that big golf course that now Park Forest sits on, he chose to use that house for his clubhouse. When Dr. Horatio Hitchcock, born 1815 in New York, became Crete's third postmaster on April 15, 1840, the post office moved, quote, north of Crete. Using tax assessor records and old plat maps, I was able to find Dr. Horatio Hitchcock's land north of Crete, section 5, with Route 1 passing right through it. His house would most likely have been on the southwest corner of present-day 36th Street and Route 1, just south of Scott's Tires. You know where Scott's Tires is. If you notice, it's on the crest of a hill. All these old pioneers chose the crest of a hill to settle on because they were, you know, had the pick of the land. So we're up to the fourth postmaster of Crete, Willard Wood, born August 28, 1808, Vermont, became Crete's fourth postmaster on November 7, 1844. The Crete post office was moved for a fourth time to the southeast corner of Route 1 and Exchange Street, then known as Woods Corners. When Willard Wood platted out Woods subdivision in 1849, or actually that should say the town of Crete in 1849, he used the name of the post office as the name of his town, with the township following the year later. Willard's plat of Crete was officially recorded in Joliet in 1852. Then as a side note, Richmond Road didn't always dead end at Stager Road, you know, how it currently dead ends there. Before Stager Road was there, Richmond Road continued at a northwest angle, connecting with Sauk Trail near the Western Avenue Sauk Trail intersection. That is most likely how it got its name. It led to the town of Richton, which is now, of course, Richton Park. At some point in time, they decided it was a little fancier to add Park to the end of the name because Grant Park was originally Grant, and then Richton Park was originally Richton. Road went to the town of Richton via the Sauk Trail. The earliest mail route between Crown Point and Joliet, established in 1837, used Richton Road to the Sauk Trail. Both the Endor and Crete post offices were located along the Crown Point to Joliet mail route, with the Endor post office being at the southeast corner. Well, yeah, further research I checked it. Now, in 1837, it would have been on Shipman Frank's property, which became Henry Dasher's. So if you're heading east out of town, past the expressway, you get to those dangerous S-curves,
Yeah.
and you go up the hill, and it's the house they tore down maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago on the north side of the road. The driveway's still there. That was the Dasher farm. Well, he owned it before the Dashers, so that's where it would have been in 1837. So that was actually the very first post office in what became Crete Township. Was Endor, with Crete following in 1838. The location of the first 2 Crete post offices are only an educated guess, actually the first 3. General land office records, tax assessor records, and plat maps, were my source. We do know, thanks to the United States Postal Records, that the post office in Crete was in Cook County from 1838 to 1840, when Mr. Bell and Dr. Batchelder were postmasters. So it's interesting to note that the second postmaster and the third postmaster were both doctors. And then the fourth was a lawyer, so it seemed, very prominent business then in town. Then moving to Will County, north of Crete, when Dr. Horatio Hitchcock was postmaster, and finally to Woods Corners in 1844. And then I just want to thank Howard Piepenbrink for helping me with, co-finding this discovery, because while I'm reading this letter, I get really excited and send out emails before I fully digest stuff, So I said, oh man, look, Howard, scanned it, sent it to him. It shows old Mr. Bell picked it out of the Bible, not Willard Wood. He says, yeah, but look where it says it was. So I didn't even see that. So yeah, big thanks to Howard Piepenbrink in that. And then I just want to read you Howard Piepenbrink's version of the story. Of course, he has a newsletter called The Lundsman. It's spelled Landsman, but the German pronunciation, Lundsman. He did 100 issues, and he was determined he wasn't going to stop until he did 100 issues quarterly, so that's 4 a year. So he's been at it a long time. Now he's doing extra issues on special topics. And he focused on the German immigrants to the Crete and Washington Township area. So now he says now that he has those 100 done, he can focus more on early Crete history, stories that don't involve the Germans, But so this is his entry into. I don't have the volume of Lundsman, but it's under the oops and updates. So you always, whenever you get new information, which happens a lot in history, there's so much more and a lot of gray areas, and Beginning on page 11 of Lundsman number 7, there appeared a list of postmasters who served the Crete Post Office, beginning with Dr. Horatio Hitchcock in 1840. Setting aside the German aspect of this newsletter, Lundsman has since learned that Dr. Hitchcock was not the first postmaster to serve the Crete-named post office. Based on post office records in Washington, D.C., the Crete, Illinois post office was actually established by the federal government in 1838, and true to the times, it would be located in the homes of the postmasters, the first being that of Henry D. Bell, resident of Cook County, in what later would become Rich Township. Well, if he lived across the street, that would actually be Bloom Township, Western's the dividing line. Batchelder lived just on the west side of Western, so that would be Rich Township. And it is interesting to note the Batchelders came from Richmond, Vermont, and they were the ones to name the township of Rich. So where do you think they got that name from? And of course, Richton was also named by the Batchelders. In an article written for Ferris Gaines of Crete and sent to Mr. Gaines somewhere between 1910 and 1915, Mary E. Cooper, who both Minnie Hughes Baker and Mary Cooper are buried right here. Willard Wood's buried right here, so that's kind of neat. The daughter of Samuel Cooper, an earlier settler, 1835, in the northeast corner of what would become Moline Township. Miss Cooper advised Mr. Gaines, Father got his mail first at Chicago, then Joliet, and then Thornton. Imagine having to go to Chicago to get your mail in 1835.
I didn't do that.
Horse.
Yeah, there were no trains. That IC tracks went through in 1851, so that was the earliest railroad around here. So yeah, you would have, and then Joliet, you know, when that was established, and then Thornton. They sent a petition for a PO to be called Thorn Grove, but there was only one by that. There was already one by that name, and they had to select another. Old Mr. Bell on the Batch Elder. Now Batch Elder is the same name as Bachelor. It's just that somewhere along the line they added a D. So when you hear, you know, Bachelor's Grove up north, and some people say it was because bachelors settled there, a bunch of bachelors. No, it's named after the family that settled there, and that would have been the Bachelors / Batch Elders. Old Mr. Bell on the Batch Elder farm said he'd find one they hadn't got and took his Bible and selected Crete. It was in Cook County at first, then at Dr. Horatio Hitchcock's. And quote, Mr. Bell served the Crete named post office as his postmaster from February 13th, 1838 until he was replaced on March 26, 1839 by Joseph Bradford Batchelder of the same location. It was not until April 15th, 1840 when Dr. Horatio Hitchcock was appointed as postmaster that the Crete post office moved to Will County, where Dr. Hitchcock then resided. Federal post offices had little, if any, regard to county boundaries. The same holds true in many jurisdictions to this very day. Meanwhile, it was in 1836, soon after Will County had been carved out of Cook and DuPage counties, that a Vermont native, Willard Wood, and his wife Diantha had moved to eastern Will County, civic-minded in every respect. The couple prospered, and in 1843, Mr. Wood, a staunch Democrat and an attorney by training, was admitted to the Illinois bar. A year later, recognizing Mr. Wood's credentials and achievements, the Honorable John Wentworth, then a Democrat member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Illinois, who subsequently affiliated with the Republican Party, becoming the mayor of Chicago in 1857, was instrumental in the appointment of Willard Wood as the fourth postmaster of the Crete Post Office. Postmasters earning more than $1,000 per year were appointed by the president. Those earning less than $1,000 per year were appointed by the Postmaster General, generally upon the advice of the local congressman or townspeople. Serving as postmaster from his home, Mr. Wood would hold that position until he was replaced by Orrin G. Kyle on July 24, 1849. So the official start of the town of Crete started in 1849. In that year, 1849, Mr. Wood laid out a town site, unincorporated, naming the place Crete, taking its name from the post office of which he was or had been postmaster. No longer would the name be solely associated with a roaming post office, thanks to Mr. Wood. It had now become a place name. Mr. Wood has ever since been rightfully recognized as the founder of Crete. And of course, we have changed that to co-founder of Crete, Diantha Wood. She was right by his side the whole way. Mr. Wood has ever since been rightfully recognized as the founder. 1 year later, 1850, Crete Township was also established. Ultimately, in 1880, the village of Crete was incorporated. And Lunsman is indebted to Ryan Martin of Crete, a descendant of Ferris Gaines, for sharing Miss Cooper's original article, which in turn has led to the earliest history of the Crete Post Office and a better understanding of how Crete became a place name. So you can see how Minnie Hughes Baker got confused. Being the granddaughter of Willard Wood, she would have been told Willard Wood was the first postmaster of Crete. Well, that was true. He was the first postmaster of the town of Crete, but he was the fourth postmaster of the post office of Crete. And then I'll go into just various articles and primary sources here. In the winter of 1837, Congress established some mail routes through the county, which had been crossed till now only by the Detroit and Fort Dearborn Mail, carried in coaches along the Michigan beach. So, yeah, right along the lakeshore there. Then by way of Liverpool, and again removed to the Bradley route. The new ones of 1837 were first from LaPorte to Joliet, taken by H.S. Pelton. So that was the guy who rode his horse. He'd come through, I think, twice a week. So it'd go from county seat of LaPorte to Valparaiso to Crown Point to Joliet, and then reverse every, I heard once a week, but maybe he did that round trip so you came through twice. And then from the county seat, they would distribute the mail throughout their county. And the principal mail line of that county for a number of years, probably till the railroad era commenced. And then a very similar article. The mail service in the early days was very limited. In 1837, Congress established some mail routes through the county, which had before only been crossed by the Detroit and Fort Dearborn mail, carried in coaches along the Michigan beach. Yeah, the first route was from LaPorte to Joliet. This was the principal mail line of the county until, I'm reading the same thing. Okay, should have proofread that. This was from a book written by Edward Callery called Place Names of Illinois. Post offices moved frequently, and many were discontinued and reestablished on several occasions. So it should not be assumed that a post office with the name of a given community originated in that community. So, I spoke of Endor earlier, and it started out down on what was then Burrville, now it's Exchange, because the way they rerouted Exchange and tap into Burrville. If you notice, when you're on Burrville, before you get to Stony and you look straight east, you're directly in line with Exchange. That's because that was Burrville. In fact, my GPS still says I'm on Burrville when I'm on Exchange there. So it started down here. The sawmill was down here. In fact, the Reverend for the Beebe Grove Congregational Society lived on Burrville. You know where that windmill is? And when you're going on Burrville, you do the little jog in the road at Clemmy, turn at the fire station. That used to go through before the fire station was built. So Burrville went all the way through. And then you do the little jog, you turn north on Clemmy and then right again on Burrville. And there's a little windmill at the entrance of Willowbrook. That's where Reverend David Ripley lived in 1839, and he was the first reverend, not of this church, but of this congregation when it was established in 1839 out of Beebe's Grove. So that just tells you, post offices move very frequently, and not to associate, the name of the post office was one specific area, because Endor, second postmaster was James Dean, so we have the Dean window in that room, named after his family. Third postmaster of Endor, I forget, but Norman Northrup was the fourth postmaster. That's when it moved up the Richton Road, and then Ebenezer Beach became the fifth postmaster of Endor, and that's when it moved into his house, the former house of Norris Beebe. And then that post office was actually discontinued for a few years and reestablished maybe in the 1860s, and it moved back down here. So it started on Burrville, moved up to Richton, and then moved back to Burrville. So what's neat is there's a map of all the post offices, and this is a map from 1839. It's called American Atlas exhibiting the post offices and post roads. And it shows the exact route that H.S. Pelton would have traveled back in 1837, starting in LaPorte, going to Valparaiso, going to, it says Lake CH, which is courthouse, so in other words, Crown Point. Then to Endor, right across the state line, up to Crete, and then to Chelsea. So Chelsea was just north of Frankfort on the Hickory Creek. Now it's all built up. There's a school in that area.
Yeah, Chelsea.
Chelsea School, thank you. Yeah. And then to Joliet.
Good for you.
Yeah. And then, so that's the Indiana view of the map. And then if you go to the Illinois view of the map, you can see Endor, and they're always very specific. The federal government, when you filled out your application for a post office, they ask you how many miles to the nearest creek and in which direction it is, because that's all they had to go by back then with land features, So it clearly shows Endor as being on the east side of Plum Creek, and maybe 3/8 of a mile south of the of Stager Road. So that clearly couldn't be up by Richton Road. That's on the west side of Plum Creek and a lot further north. And then it shows Crete. Well, you'd think that's Crete here, but that's Crete in 1839, so that's on the Batchelder farm. And if you notice the line there, that represents, Stager Road extended. and sure enough, it's in Rich Township, just west of Western. So that represents the Crete Post Office on the Batchelder farm. So we can pass these around later. And these are the original post office records that are on Ancestry.com. And you can see Cook County, Illinois. And then we have the Crete entry under Cook County. Henry D. Bell, July something, 1838. Joseph Batchelder, 1839. And then the next page, it says Will County. And then the next record, this is for Will County. So this is a few years later. Crete, and above Crete it says last in Cook County. Horatio Hitchcock, 1840. Willard Wood, 1844. And then, so those are the original post office records. And then this, I forget who I got this from, Tim or Phyllis. But when they did the dedication of the Crete Post Office, that's still where it is. So we have a dedication program of the new Crete Post Office, Saturday, November 28th, 1959, Benton Cash Streets. Somehow Ray Piepenbrink didn't catch this because yeah, he would have looked at this and go, what? But it says Crete, Will County, Illinois, established in Cook County on February 13th, 1838. And then it gives all the postmasters, and of course, Henry D. Bell, February 13th, 1838. Joseph Bradford Batchelder, March 26, 1839. Horatio Hitchcock, 1840. So they don't put a line there where it moved over to Will County, but it would have been between Batchelder and Hitchcock. So we have the original dedication program in our Historical Society collection. For this purposes of handing it around, I just broke it down. And then you can go to USPS.com, the official United States Postal Service website. They have a Postmaster Finder tool. Type in Crete, Illinois, and this is what pops up. Originally established in Cook County. Henry Bell, it's all the same info, 1838. Joseph Bradford Batchelor, 1839. Changed to Wills County, they spelled it wrong. April 15th, 1840. Horatio Hitchcock, Wood, Kyle. So these are all primary sources that all verify Mary Cooper's letter to a T. I mean, and then I just want to go into, the Bells are very hard to research because they didn't stay long. They continued west to look for better, greener pastures or whatever. Very hard to research. I think I found him, and he ended up in Schuyler County, which is right down the Illinois River. So, very easy to travel back in the early days from Crete. You get on the Illinois, or Des Plaines goes into the Illinois, I believe. And so it's not quite the St. Louis, but I don't know, southwest of Peoria somewhere. So very hard family, and the Chicago Heights history books and the Park Forest history books mention John Bell and that rock that's on on Sauk Trail. It's on the old McCoy farm, and it lists all the early settlers, and it says John Bell. Well, John Bell was Henry Bell's cousin. So we have the Bells, living right in that area. So this would be Joseph Bradford Batchelder, Crete's second postmaster, and his wife Louisa Ann. Methodist members of the Underground Railroad team on the Illinois frontier. Joseph Batchelder, or Batchelor, and his wife Louisa Batchelder aided their neighbors in conveying desperate slaves, or freedom seekers we call nowadays, until her untimely death at age 27. The Batchelders operated a safe house at their farm in Rich Township near Western Avenue and Sauk Trail in Chicago, Park Forest. They collaborated with John McCoy and Sabre McCoy, agents of the secret network at Thornton, west of Chicago. So yeah, this is written by somebody in Chicago, obviously. Because they were, I guess you'd call it Chicago banks. The Batchelder farm is part of Park Forest, Illinois. So it's interesting to note in the Caroline Quarles story, if you're familiar with that, before she comes to Menor's Beebe's house, she's at Reuben Beach's house up in Hadley. Well, Reuben Beach was the first postmaster of the Hadley post office. Okay, and so it seems we have, and Samuel Cushing was postmaster at the Endor Post Office for a time. So we have at least 3 verified postmasters, federal employees breaking federal laws, helping on the Underground Railroad, which is kind of neat. Yeah, so, and then the Beaches obviously knew the Beebes because not only did they send Carolina corals and Lyman Goodnote to them, when Menor's Beebe died, Reuben Beach's son married Dorothy, Menor's widow. So they obviously knew each other. They go downtown Chicago to anti-slavery meetings. And then this is more Batchelder info. In 1835, Joseph and Anna Batchelder family settled the area around Western Avenue and Sauk Trail with the John Bell family. The Bells stayed until about 1860. When they left, the Batchelders bought the Bell farm and added it to their own. This property would later form the largest portion of Park Forest. So this is the 1862 plat map. This line represents Stager Road. Obviously Stager Road dead ends here. This line represents Western. The Batchelder farm house would have been right in the northwest corner of Western and Sauk Trail. The Bells would have lived right across the street, either south of Sauk Trail or north Island. And then, if you ever want to find out who first purchased a piece of land off the federal government when it went up for sale in 1838, you can go to the Bureau of Land Management General Land Office records, so BLM GLO, just Google that, BLM space GLO. And type in your township number, section number, range, and meridian. So Crete's would be, I believe, township 34 north, and then we are range 14 and 15 east because we have a fractional township section. Since we're along the state line, there's a little extra. Most townships are 6 miles by 6 miles, but where the surveyor started, it left a little more area towards state line, so we have another 1.5 miles. That's called the Crete Fractional Township. So you probably heard of Thornton Fractional High School. Same thing. So once you figure out your township number, your range number, we're east of the 3rd prime meridian, plug those numbers in, and you'll get all the first owners of the land around here. A lot of them are land speculators, so don't assume, just because this person bought that land that they live there. In fact, Willard Wood, I guess he couldn't afford the land he settled on at first, and Charles Walker bought it. He was a land speculator. And so Willard Wood purchased it off of Charles Walker, his portion of Section 8 and 9, at 33% interest. So can you imagine that? In 3 years. So I don't know why he didn't save up a little more money back east. So this just shows the Batchelder property, date purchased November 29th, 1838. And then this is Batchelder family genealogy book. It has some neat information about Dr. Joseph Bradford Batchelder, Crete's second postmaster. Born Worcester, Vermont, November 5th, 1811. Married Richmond, Vermont, to Louisa Ann Farnsworth, born 1818. Died in Chicago, April 1845. Joseph Bradford Batchelder, second son of Joseph and Anna Batchelder, was born in Vermont, passing his early years on his family farm in that state. Having a desire for a different life at the age of 17, he apprenticed himself to a jeweler in Boston, but before completing his trade, was obliged by severe illness to return home. 3 years after his marriage to Louisa Ann Farnsworth, tiring of farming among the hills and stones, he took his wife and year-old child, Emma, in company with his father's family to the wilds of Illinois, Thorn Grove. This was the frontier back then, this was the Northwest Territory. Actually, Illinois was started in 1818, so it would have been a state by then. But yeah, this was the wild frontier. It's kind of cool. Thorn Grove, 30 miles south of Chicago. So Thorn Grove is all the grove that surrounds Thorn Creek and all of its tributaries. So that includes all the creeks that flow into Thorn Creek, which includes Goose Creek, which flows into Deer Creek, which then flows into Thorn Creek. So that we're on the very southeastern edge of Thorn Grove here. So whenever you're trying to research early Creek history prior to, let's say the late 1840s, it's going to either be called Thorn Grove. Sometimes it'll be called Thorn Creek Precinct because that's when they divided up the land for voting purposes. Basically, Crete and Monique were combined for a while as Thorn Creek Precinct. So the 1840 census is under Thorn Creek Precinct. You won't find Crete Township because it didn't exist yet. And of course, Beebe's Grove is Plum Creek. And really, there are not a lot of tributaries to Plum Creek. So, when you're driving east of town on Exchange and you see a long line of woods, that's Beebe's Grove. And then when you're driving right before that dangerous intersection, you're in the woods, that's Beebe's Grove. 30 miles south of Chicago, Thorn Grove's 30 miles south of Chicago. His was the first frame house in that locality, and though not large, was dignified by the name of Tavern. So, in other words, that was a hotel. Back then, hotel, tavern, interchangeable. 4 years were passed in this rural life when he removed to the growing village of Chicago, purchasing a residence, lot 123 Wells Street, 30 feet by 80 feet for $175, being on the very edge of the improved part of the town, though between Washington and Madison stations. Here for a time he was clerk in the store of Hamilton and White. Later on was for years a botanic physician, doing good service during the dread cholera seasons. He was quite a Bible student, though never accepting the orthodox interpretation thereof. He was a man of strict integrity, honest and honorable in his dealings, genial, affable, making many friends among the early settlers, a man of refined taste and good and temperate habits, and clear-sighted in Eusebius matters. He was an unfortunate participant in the terrors of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, never fully recovering from the shock. His income swept away, many friends made homeless. He was from this time physically and mentally unfit for active business. The property he had acquired had made him quite wealthy. You can imagine buying some land in Chicago and then, property values go through the roof. Having lost his wife and 3 children, and made his home in his latter years with his only surviving child, Mrs. J.B. Mulliken, in Detroit, Michigan. So he died in Detroit, Michigan. His parents are buried right here, Joseph and Anna Batchelder. So that's another couple that were conductors on the Underground Railroad, buried right to the west of us. And then I found this in a book called The First 100 Years, Blue Island Historical Review. There was also a Dr. Batchelder. He was a lifesaver of the county. He had a regular route, which he covered as regularly as does a book agent. He came to our house from the south, going north and west through Cook County, about every 3 months on horseback, saddlebags and cross filled with remedies for every known and unknown disease. Everybody must buy a box of Brandreth's pills, a bottle of number 6, the making of a composition tea, cherry pectoral, etc. He always remained overnight. If belated, he always remained overnight. Physicians were fewer to be trusted. So, they were giving these people medicines, they had no idea what they were doing. So Dr. Batchelder had a large practice. Every mother or housewife was a good nurse and fairly successful doctor. The state of the case demanded that she should be. Written by Mrs. Ann Fuller. Then we go to a census of 1850 in Rich Township, and it shows his parents, Joseph Batchelor and Anna Batchelor. Joseph was a farmer. Anna, doesn't say. And then their son, Joseph Batchelder, 38, and it says MD, so a doctor of medicines. And then I want to finish up by just reading the whole letter from Mary Cooper, because you don't get any older Crete history than this. Eighth generation Crete resident. My fourth great grandfather, Samuel and Elmira Gaines, came here in 1836, just across Western, so technically Monee Township, right where the water tower is. Again, the high point on the land. Samuel Cooper, his cousin, who arrived a year earlier, was just down the hill from him where the Speedway gas station is. So Cooper, he first came to, well, it gets to that. When Samuel Ward Gaines traveled west, he first stopped in Ohio. All the land was taken. So he came out to where his cousin was, you know. So this was
Forest up in Ohio, then where?
yeah, Euclid, so a suburb, well, now it's Cleveland. What's
Cleveland.
Yeah, Euclid, yeah.
But before that, where was he from?
He came from Middletown, Connecticut.
Connecticut.
Yeah. The Coopers were descended from three brothers who came from England to the New England colonies in a very early day. Thomas Cooper of Chatham, Connecticut, Middlesex County, married Sarah Ward. Their children were Hannah, Dennis, Samuel, David, Thomas, Abigail / Aunt Navy, Susan, Ruth, and Sarah.
Oh my God.
Well, on Ancestry, I found they had more kids. There was nothing to do back then. Just on here, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, but they had more.
I wonder
But-
how old-
Sounds like 12 to me.
How old was she when she died?
Yeah, I don't know.
Because I mean.
Aunt Navy never married. Ruth married a sea captain named Mr. Klein, or Mick Klein. Hannah married a Gaines, and their son was Samuel Ward Gaines, your grandfather. So he's talking about Ferris's grandfather, my fourth great grandfather. The Cooper home was a large farm on the Connecticut River in Connecticut. Dennis, my grandfather, Dennis Cooper, married in 1810. That is the only date I have about the family. After a few years, he moved to Euclid in northern Ohio, where his wife's folks, the Peltons. Now it's interesting, remember the guy who rode on the horse delivering mail
Yeah.
from LaPorte to,
Yeah.
to Joliet, was H.S. Pelton. So you gotta wonder if they were related. Where his wife folks, the Peltons, had moved. Aunt Navy's bought out the other heirs and became the owner of the farm in Connecticut. Uncle George, Captain Cooper, was in the Civil War and learned from the officers of a Connecticut regiment that she was still living and had planted many acres of quinces and pears. In 1 year, she sold 12,000, looks like bushels, of quinces and pears, or $1,200 worth. I am not sure which. Uncle George and father said Ruth's children and Samuel Ward Gaines' sister still lived in Connecticut so far as they know, and that probably they inherited her property. I think Aunt Navy would be one of the various branches of the family would know something about. She was a very able woman and very close. Grandfather went back to Connecticut on horseback and went to see her first. He asked her for feed for his horse, and she got him some oats in a quart basin. I can't read the first word. That time, it seemed that nearly all the people drank liquor. I don't mean that the women did. There was an uncle that was an officer in the army and was killed in the attack on Quebec in one of the colonial wars. I think he was a Cooper. There was an uncle in the Revolutionary War, but I do not think he was on the Cooper side. I never heard of any direct ancestor in the old wars. There was an Uncle Ward, his surname was Ward, who was a man of influence and had some state office. I suppose that is the reason the name Ward comes in the Gaines and Cooper family so much. I do not know whether Mr. Gaines had brothers. Most likely he did. I am writing this, I have underlined words that I thought might be of help to you in picking out what you wished to know. So Ferris would write all of his cousins and relatives asking about the family and if they have any old stories to tell. And sometimes he would write it and then leave a blank where he wanted them to fill in the answer. So, you know, he was a very sharp guy. As your father died when you were young, that's Horatio Gaines. He was, this is a whole other story. He was a founder of, well, now they're the FNIM, but it was the Bloom, Thornton, and Crete Detective Association, and there were a lot of horse thieves back in the day. And so they formed a posse, and when you had one police guy to cover the whole township, it didn't do much. So one day, he owned, Dr. Piscopo's office north of town with the pillars. That's where he lived, and his barn was across the street. Now it's an empty lot, so on the east side of, he witnessed horse thieves stealing his horses. So this is what he did for a living. He helped other people retrieve their horses, and he wasn't gonna let that happen. So he actually chased them all the way up to Dalton, and he was staying low, and he saw the thieves carry his horses into the barn, and he waited a little bit, walked into the barn, and they were waiting for him and dropped sandbags on his head. He ended up in the Kankakee Insane Asylum for the rest of his life. Now, they let him come home the last week of his life so he could die at home. And all this information, we always heard Horatio was killed by horse thieves. Well, the true story came out in an abstract of title book that Dr. Piscopo had. And it said this very personal story. And I'm still trying to get copies of it. He lent it to my Uncle Jeff, because he was friends with Jeff Gaines, Easy Muffler. And Jeff's reading this, and he's like, "Are you playing jokes on me?" Is this See, because back then, in those days, it was probably shameful to have a relative in an insane asylum. So they never told that story. And all we heard was Horatio was killed by horse thieves. As your father died when you were young, I take it that you never heard much about the old timers, and I will write some things just because I think you may like to read them. Samuel Ward Gaines became a shoemaker. He married, and after living a few years in Middletown, Connecticut, I think that is the place Mr. Gaines always talked of, and she's correct. He decided to come west, and they had come to his Uncle Dennis's in Ohio, but he found that was an old settled region, and that his cousins were intending to live in Illinois. So they came also in 1836. I think they did not come with a moving wagon. I have a dim idea that they came on Lake Erie as far as they could, and then a canal helped them some, and they and someone else hired a man with a team to bring them some distance. I think in Chicago they hired someone to bring them to Thorn Grove, then had some furniture shipped by the lakes to Chicago and got it from there after they were settled. Father came to Illinois in 1835, so Samuel Ward Cooper, with a pack of goods on his back to sell and pay his way. Mr. Cole and many others came that same way. So, George and Bob Kester are direct descendants of John Cole. That's who she's talking about. And that's the oldest house in Crete, and it's still owned by the same family. 1847, it's the red house, 2 houses south of the library. Father went back to Ohio soon to make arrangements to come to settle, and came in 1837, came back in 1837. I think he was in Illinois when Mr. Gaines came. He boarded with them before he was married. Mrs. Gaines was a very nice woman. She and several sisters were left orphans. She had always worked hard, but had lived with nice people who were kind to her. Her sister Mary used to write to her, and after her death corresponded with Harriet. So Harriet Gaines, Horatio's sister. The descendants of other sons of Thomas Cooper settled in Illinois and Iowa, and used to write to Father and his brothers hoping to meet them. And there were several meetings in Iowa that were very pleasant. And then she finishes, well, not finishes the letter, but then we go into Father got his mail in Chicago. And then she finishes with, she signs her name, so she's thinking the letter's done, but Ferris wants to know the history, so she thinks of a few more things and writes another page. Harriet told of an uncle who died from the effects of a sunstroke, but I think he died young. Mrs. Gaines was considered the neatest housekeeper and the best cook in the neighborhood. She was so kind to all the little children. The uncle in the Revolutionary War was captured by the British, and at the close of the war, when they were released, the British treated them to liquor. It was poisoned, and he and many other soldiers died from the effects. I think he was related to Grandma Cooper. So Grandma Cooper was a Doan, and sure enough, going back another generation from Grandma Cooper, there was a Seth Doan, and I found written story about him being killed by the British in the Revolutionary War. So I'm pretty sure she's talking about this Seth Doan Jr. So I think I went over everything. You want me to hand around? Here's the shows the location of the post offices. And 1862 plat showing the batch elder where Crete originated in this area. Does anybody have any questions?
Where'd the map with the post office come from?
It's online. I'll send you the link, and it's for the entire country. And
Okay.
so I think Illinois and they like group two or three states
Okay.
together.
But it's a map site or the post office site?
It's an atlas site, yeah,
Atlas site.
yeah. And just that one site has just that atlas.
Okay.
You know, there's like 15 images.
Right.
First, an entire view of the country, and then more specifically regions.
Really cool to get some, like those, plotted, printed, whatever, put in a frame and put it
Yeah,
up here somewhere.
absolutely. Yeah.
Whatever happened to
That'd be a
that?
good idea.
Yeah.
Whatever happened to Endor? Okay, it didn't take off, and Crete took off. And so if you remember, it was Give Fink's shop, that green building across from the tennis courts. That's where Mr. Dasher, Charles Dasher, I think his name was, after Herman Dasher, his son took over the sawmill out at Endor. He moved those buildings into Crete. So that green building originally stood out at Endor. And that was his sawmill. So we have pictures.
Where would Endor have been, like the streets that we have now?
Okay, really the epicenter, there's a green pipe sticking out of the ground at the top of the hill. So it's
Like this?
west of Clemmy on Exchange.
Okay.
Okay, and now the road is cut into the top of the hill. So if you're noticing the topography, and you're going on top of the hill, there's Joe Jordan Hansen is one of our members. She's the closest to Endor. She sits on Endor, but the post office and store were just to the west of her house. And just notice the topography, and the Dasher farm, the driveway's still there. The Forest Reserve has a chain over
The driveway.
the driveway there.
That's
So
what
it just
confused
kind of
me.
ceased to exist?
It ceased to exist, yeah, it didn't take off, and so the post office was discontinued in the 1890s, or no, early 1900s. And they just quit the post office. There was a store up there, so in the 1862 plat, it shows it says store post office for, there's a black dot for the houses, and one of the black dots, they note store/post office. Charles Horn was the one who ran that store in the 1860s, and then he moved into town and became Crete's first mayor. Okay. So a few weeks ago, I was walking by Charles Horn's house, which is the house just north of the Methodist church, and I noticed this headstone leaning against the tree. Have you heard this story?
Yeah.
And the homeowner, I told her, it's going in the museum. Or no, I told her who it was. She says, "Oh, you can have it for the museum. I'm excited for you guys, And she says, "I think it's a screw up from the monument maker in town, where Crete's backyard now sits. They made monuments." And so I took it home, and I knew that it looked identical to John Horn's gravestone, which still sits out at Endor on the south side of Exchange, in that now it's owned by the Forest Reserve. It used to be on Trinity Lutheran Church's property. You'll see two evergreens sticking up a couple hundred feet way out there. And his headstone still stands out there, but his body was moved into Crete Cemetery. Well, this one must have originally been out there as well, and that's John Horn's son, John Horn, Charles Horn's brother. But whenever they would move a body and just get a big family headstone and engrave everybody's names on one headstone like they did with the Horns in Crete Cemetery, how they would, I guess, destroy the old headstone so nobody got confused, they'd chop the name off. So John Horn's out at Endor has the name chopped off, but his death date is an exact, Howard Heathbury figured this out, whose it was, but nobody knew whose grave it was. The death date matched up exactly, and then it gives years, months, and days lived, and then so you can figure out the birthday, and his birthday matched up exactly. Well, that's what I did. You can go online and do a tombstone birthday calculator, So you put the death date, they always put the death date, never the birth date. You had to do the math. And then, so you just, it's 35 years, 11 months, 5 days, let's say, and then it figures out the birthday. And then you go on Ancestry or whatever, and somebody has him in the family tree, and sure enough, it matched up exactly. So yeah, he probably kept it as a memento, or sometimes they would even just lay him flat, upside down as a sidewalk. Because people used what they had back in the day. They did not have money to go to Walmart and buy something. You had to make it. So yeah, that's Charles Horn's brother's headstone, and Charles Horn ran the store, post office out there, or at least the store in the 1860s, late 50s, 1860s, early 70s. Yeah, and it just never took off. There was a small little settlement, maybe 4 houses on both sides of the road. It's yeah, it just, now there's almost nothing there.
So Crete just absorbed all that.
Yeah, yeah.
Crete got a railroad, and that's probably what made it thrive. Those other places were out in the country. No railroad went through there. There's another small town farther south called Bemis.
Yes.
That's Bemis Road. Yeah, that never really materialized either, but I believe they had a post office there too.
Well, that's where the name of Bemis comes from. Again, it was first a post office, because I went to the Chicago National Archives. I'm forgetting the name right now. It's the National Archives, and it's in a branch of it is in Chicago, and they have all the early post office records. So I was doing research on the Crete Post Office and and they have it all on microfilm. So you request your microfilm, and you go over to the scanner. You feed it into the scanner and put it on auto, and I got 1,300 images. And then I got those all in a couple hours. They should have that all automatically scanned. So when you go in there requesting stuff, just give me your thumb drive, but they haven't gotten around to it yet. But so I just saved everyone for our portion of Will County, maybe all of Will County, I forget. And in it is the application to establish Bemis, okay? And in it, you know what they wanted to name it first? Cook, with an E. And it's crossed out, probably because it was too close to Cook County, too close of a name to Cook County. And on the very front, the very first page of all these records was the how to name a post office, right? So the story Ray Beaker told of how Willard Wood chose the name was exactly what the rules were to come up with a name. So they said it should be short, easy to spell, preferably one word. If it's 2 words, it's going to have to be approved. Basically, 1 word, it's approved. And this was all in the earlier story of how Willard Wood came up with the name, but those were the rules these postmasters were given to how to name a post office. So yeah, in the Bemis application page, they named it Cook at first. It's crossed out, and then they spell Bemis, B-E-M-E-S. Okay, that's the original. So the road name is correct. I know there's a few old timers who swear. Well, I think because that's how it's pronounced, it got changed. So if you read the early newspaper articles, it starts out B-E-M-E-S. We have a very nice collection of old newspaper articles in a scrapbook, either put together by Hotons or Kesters, I'm not sure which. And then about 10, not too far later, 10 to 20 years later, they started spelling it with an I, and then it goes back to E, But if you look at that first application, which is the most accurate, it spells it B-E-M-E-S. So I know there was I think a guy in government, commissioners of highways or something in the 80s, who had the spelling of the road changed back to the original spelling. Because they were spelling it as B-E-M-E-S-I-S for many, many years. Right. And so now, of course, it's corrected, because he probably found these old records, primary sources that you can't argue with once you discover them.
I remember seeing a sign out there that showed a Bemis been around for like 40 years.
Yeah, it was a relatively late post office. By late, I mean late 1880s, compared to these, which were 1830s. Eagle Lake Post Office was another one that was fairly late 1800s. Trying to think of the post offices around here. Eagle Lake Post Office, you know where that's at, it's the Eagle Lake Road until you hit Gates, and you turn right and the settlement's still there. All those houses, that was Eagle Lake. And then there's a neat map showing the mail route in the early 1900s of how they got from one post office to the next, and you know, it shows arrows going down this road to get from Bemis to Eagle Lake and back to Crete. That was the mail route. I think that's all the small post offices in Crete Township I can think of, and Washington Township.
Did you say at the beginning of the story that there was one in Monee that was called Foreign Grove?
She had it wrong.
It was wrong?
Yeah, that was the first Crete post office she was referring to.
Oh,
Yeah, so, did I have, I can read about it. That was in the, yeah, she should have said, what's it, Boney Township? She should have said Rich Township.
okay. Oh, okay.
Or Bloom, you know, Bells supposedly lived across the street.
Right.
But again, it was only there for 2 years.
Okay.
Very easy, you know, 50, 60, 70 years later,
Right.
to overlook or forget where it was.
Right, right.
In fact, in the 1878 History of Will County book, it says Endor started up on Richmond Road. Well, they're going back 40 years in memory, and they're forgetting when Ship and Frank and James Dean were postmasters, and just remembering when Norman Northrup had it. So it says it started out on Richmond Road, and then moved down to the Endor settlement that we all know now. Well, you know, back in 1870.
But before Richton, it had been back on.
It had been on Burrville. It
Right.
moved up to Richmond and then
Right.
was discontinued after up on Richmond, brought back 5 to 10 years later down on Burrville. Because it was in the postmaster's house. So when they figure out where the postmasters lived, that's where it was. So when it moves around and in a couple of years, you know, 40 years later, it's very hard to remember that. That post office was somewhere for a year.
Right.
Any other questions? Yeah.
And just later on, then the post office moved from one business to another business in Crete.
Yeah.
It was wherever
Yeah.
they said, oh, I'll take it, and,
Yep.
yeah, and it was good for the business because people would come in
Yeah.
to get their mail
Yeah.
and buy some goods.
Yeah.
that
Well,
they
Batch
were
Elders was
selling.
a tavern, there was a hotel, so that brought people into their hotel. Dr. Hitchcock was a doctor, so that brought people into his house. If they needed a doctor, now they knew a doctor. So yeah, it was always somebody from having another business and getting, foot traffic into their place of business. Any other questions? All right, that concludes my speech.
That's good.